Letitia Brown is a black woman in her 30s, working as a housemaid in the luxurious mansion of Nicholas Carlisle, one of the most influential people in the city and the owner of Carlisle Holdings. Getting a job in the Carlisle house was not easy. Employers in wealthy neighborhoods chose workers strictly, guided not only by professional skills but also by social background, appearance, and a readiness to remain invisible. Letitia knew she had secured this job thanks to recommendations and years of experience, but she had to prove her right to be in this house every day by maintaining impeccable order. Every morning she rose long before dawn, made her way to Carlisle's mansion, located in a closed elite district, and began her work while the owners were still asleep. Letitia cleaned every corner of the enormous house, polished mirrors, scrubbed tables, and kept the bedrooms and bathrooms spotless. The mansion was filled with expensive antiques and artwork. Each item reminded her that she was in someone else's world, a world where she was only a helper, a shadow, meant to maintain her employer's perfect lives. Nicholas Carlisle, her employer, was an arrogant and reserved man. His presence could be felt throughout the house. Letitia never felt comfortable in his presence. Nicholas rarely spoke to the staff and generally did not stoop to express any gratitude for their work. To him, housekeepers were part of the decor, like his expensive paintings or furniture. Sometimes he would walk past Letitia without even glancing at her, and despite years of service, she remained invisible to him. However, over the following months, they had several brief yet significant encounters. One evening when Letitia stayed late to finish cleaning, Nicholas was still in his office. She tried to clean quietly so as not to disturb him, but noticing her, he invited her to take a break and have a glass of wine. Letitia felt awkward, but agreed out of politeness, unaware of how this would change her life. That evening, a fleeting closeness emerged between them, and Letitia felt that she mattered to him, if only for a moment. A spark of hope ignited within her. Perhaps Nicholas wasn't as distant and cold as he seemed. Weeks passed. Letitia began to notice something unusual with her body. She experienced morning sickness, fatigue that she hadn't dealt with before. Her body, accustomed to hard physical labor, now felt uncharacteristically weak even with her usual workload. Initially, Letitia thought it was due to her demanding schedule, but as the symptoms worsened, she decided to see a doctor at a local clinic. The doctor's diagnosis struck her like a bolt from the blue. She was pregnant. A mix of fear, confusion, and joy overwhelmed her. Thoughts whirled in her mind. She would soon have a child, her own family, but with joy came the realization of the challenges that lay ahead. Working in Carlisle's home, she had seen how much he valued status, reputation, and social standing. Nicholas had often shown disdain for people he considered beneath him on the social ladder, and she, as a working-class woman and black, was, in his eyes, even lower than other employees. For several days Letitia wrestled with uncertainty, trying to figure out what to do. She hoped that despite Nicholas's cold demeanor, he might show compassion and support her and their future child. Finally, gathering her courage, Letitia decided to talk to him. She waited for a moment when Nicholas was alone in his office and entered quietly, trying to steady her trembling hands. When she told him about the pregnancy, Nicholas was initially stunned, and then his face twisted into a cold, disdainful mask. His eyes, usually calm and confident, flared with irritation and even fear. Letitia noticed how he tensed, as if feeling threatened. To him, her words were not news, but a disaster that could ruin his carefully constructed image. In his eyes, she was merely an employee who had inconvenienced him, and her problem didn't concern him at all. Nicholas didn't even let Letitia finish speaking. With coldness and cruelty, he made it clear that he had no intention of supporting her or acknowledging the child. He said it was simply unacceptable, and that her pregnancy could ruin his flawless image and business. Letitia remained silent, shocked by his reaction. She felt humiliated and stripped of the right even to ask for support. Worse yet, Nicholas ordered her immediate dismissal without notice or severance. He offered her a small sum of money to leave town and start a new life somewhere far away. He also made it clear that if she ever tried to contact him or demand support, he would use his influence to destroy her reputation and life. In that moment, Letitia understood that she had been nothing more than a temporary plaything for him, something he could dispose of as he pleased. With a deep sense of injustice and pain, she left the office. All she had was a small sum of money and a suitcase of belongings. She realized that Nicholas saw her not as a person, but as a mere servant, someone obligated to obey his will and disappear when no longer needed. Letitia understood that to Nicholas, her skin color and lowly position in the household were reasons enough to see her as beneath his dignity. In Nicholas Carlisle's world, power and status took precedence over any human feelings, and people like Letitia were just cogs, easily replaced. She spent several days contemplating her future. Her familiar world was crumbling before her eyes, but despite all the hardships, she felt compelled to fight for her child's future. Letitia decided to leave the city, where she had been treated so harshly, and try to start a new life, far from the shadow of Nicholas Carlisle and his haughty circle. During the lonely nights she spent alone, her thoughts often returned to that evening in his office when she had seen not just an employer, but, as it seemed then, a person. Now she saw his true face, the face of a man for whom skin color and social status were barriers preventing him from showing any compassion or responsibility. Letitia left the city, leaving behind her grievances and memories of the brief romance with Nicholas Carlisle, determined to start anew. She chose a small town a few hours' drive away, where no one knew about her past. Shortly after her arrival, she rented modest accommodation, a small, cramped apartment in an old neighborhood where the sounds of neighbors and passing cars echoed through the nights. The setting was far from the luxury of Carlisle's mansion, but here Letitia felt safe. The pregnancy was not easy. Without a stable income or support, Letitia had to find any work she could to gather money for basic necessities. She took a job as a waitress at a local cafe, enduring fatigue and nausea that accompanied her every step. The cafe was busy and crowded, especially in the mornings, and she had to rise at dawn to prepare the establishment for opening. Letitia bore it all, understanding that she needed to provide for her child. She worked late, despite the heaviness in her body and the pain in her back, all to feed herself and her future baby. The cafe job had its difficulties. Customers often treated her arrogantly, not looking her in the eyes, tossing money on the table, and impatiently demanding attention. Most of her colleagues, young men and women, paid little attention to her, seeing her as just another worker without ambition or dreams. Sometimes Letitia caught their glances, some filled with pity, others with disdain. But what saddened her most was that even here, far from her past life, she continued to face inequality and prejudice because of her skin color. Every day, returning home from work, Letitia felt the weight of loneliness. She realized she would have to raise her child alone, without family or friends. At night, lying on her narrow bed, she pondered the future, trying to quell her fears. Thoughts that Nicholas could be part of her child's life left a bitter taste of regret. She imagined he might at least financially support them or visit even once, but she knew these were just empty dreams. As her pregnancy reached its late stage, working became especially challenging. Every movement was difficult now. For the first time in her life, Letitia began to fear she might not cope. Physically exhausted, she continued to fulfill her duties, though every step took tremendous effort. But in this struggle, her resilience emerged. She never complained or asked for help. Letitia believed she could make it through for her child. Finally, the day came when she felt her baby was ready to be born. She called a taxi and went to the nearest hospital, where a doctor admitted her, and just a few hours later, in a room full of unfamiliar faces, nurses and doctors, she heard the first cry of her son, Marcus. That sound was a beam of light, a glimmer of hope in her life. She looked at him with awe, feeling that her entire life now belonged to this little being. After being discharged from the hospital, Letitia returned to her apartment, now with Marcus in her arms. The next few months were a true test for her. She was worn out by sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and caring for her infant. Yet despite her fatigue, she found a strength within herself she hadn't known. She was now a mother, and this role gave her a new purpose and strength to keep fighting. The modest benefits and the savings she had managed to set aside quickly ran out. Letitia had to return to work sooner than planned, leaving Marcus in the care of an elderly neighbor. This woman, Mrs. Gray, was kind and understanding. She saw how hard Letitia worked to support her son and offered to watch the baby for a symbolic fee. Letitia gratefully accepted her help, understanding she couldn't manage otherwise. Back at work, Letitia plunged into endless routines, where every day resembled the last. Sometimes she felt trapped in a cycle with no escape. Memories of the past surfaced less often but still reminded her, stirring deep sadness. She felt anger at herself for having once allowed herself to fall in love with Nicholas and believe in the possibility of something more. But now her life was fully dedicated to her son, and she was determined to fight for his happiness, no matter how hard that fight would be. Years passed, and Letitia watched her son grow. He was a curious and energetic child, showing a thirst for knowledge and a deep interest in the world around him from a young age. Letitia saw in him qualities that were characteristic of her: persistence, a desire to understand and experience the world. But she also noticed traits of Nicholas in him, a certain self-confidence that, despite their modest living conditions, blossomed within him like an echo of the past, reminding her of those days she tried so hard to forget. She continued working at the cafe, often staying late to earn enough to provide for Marcus's needs. Every cent she earned went to his necessities: clothing, books, school supplies. She saw herself reflected in her son and understood that her sacrifices were not in vain. Letitia never told Marcus about his father, fearing that knowing who he was might affect his life and sow resentment or anger within him. Although Letitia suffered from keeping this from her son, she firmly believed it was for the best. Marcus grew up in a world surrounded only by motherly love and care, and Letitia did her best to create a safe and loving environment for him. She tried to forget the past, but sometimes, looking at Marcus, she saw in his features a reminder of the man who had rejected her and left them without support. It was painful, but Letitia had learned to live with this pain, considering it an inseparable part of her life. Her heart, despite all the hardships and trials, remained full of hope. Letitia believed that one day her efforts would be rewarded and that her son would be able to achieve everything she dreamed of for him. She watched her sleeping boy with reverence and love, understanding that despite the difficulties, she had a reason to be happy. The years flew by unnoticed, and Marcus, Letitia's son, grew up, transforming into a curious and intelligent teenager. He was raised amid modest but honest hardships, witnessing his mother work tirelessly to support them both. As time went on, his questions about family and the past became more frequent, carrying a note of concern that Letitia found increasingly difficult to ignore. Marcus was a teenager, with a strong sense of justice, and this often led him to wonder why their family consisted only of him and his mother. From a young age, he had started asking questions that Letitia tried to avoid, sidestepping with simple explanations. However, with each passing year, her answers seemed less convincing to him. She could see doubt kindling in his eyes, growing into a firm determination to uncover the truth. Marcus was tall and slender, with defined facial features and deep brown eyes that reflected his resolve. He had inherited Letitia's resilience and work ethic, but there was something else within him, something independent of upbringing. There was a confidence, even a certain authority in his gaze, that reminded Letitia of his biological father. Sometimes this showed in the way he stood with arms crossed or in the look in his eyes when he made a decision, those very traits Letitia had tried to forget, and each reminder struck her heart like a painful jab. From time to time, Marcus noticed how his mother grew pensive and withdrew when he asked about his father. She appeared troubled, her voice softened, and her gaze grew distant. Marcus understood that it was a difficult topic for her, but this only fueled his curiosity. At some point, he realized that this unknown person, his father, had become a mystery he was determined to solve. He wanted to know where his strong will came from, this desire to prove to everyone and himself that he was capable of more. Letitia tried to steer Marcus away from this subject, always urging him to focus on his studies and preparation for the future. She wanted to protect him from the pain the truth might bring, knowing how much she had endured herself. As the years passed, and Marcus entered high school, Letitia saw his determination to find answers grow, and she realized that the time had come when ignoring his questions would no longer work. One day after returning home from a hard day at work, Letitia found Marcus rummaging through an old wooden box where she kept some papers and photos. She froze in the doorway, seeing him holding an old, worn photograph of herself and Nicholas Carlisle, the very man who had left her alone with a child 20 years earlier. In the picture, Letitia looked younger, unaware of what lay ahead, appearing naive and happy. Beside her stood Nicholas, handsome and self-assured, with a faint smile that had once seemed so charming to her. Marcus stared at the photograph, seemingly trying to grasp something he couldn't yet fully understand. He had already noticed that the person in the picture, next to his mother, was someone unfamiliar to him, but who somehow resembled him. Letitia realized that he needed to hear the truth, but the words were stuck in her throat. Inside her, emotions battled, fear of revealing the whole truth to him, fear that it might hurt him, and, at the same time, relief that she would no longer have to live with this secret. She slowly approached her son, whose eyes sparkled with determination. She understood that he had a right to know his past, even if that past involved betrayal and pain. Letitia sat down next to Marcus, and trying to steady the tremor in her voice, began telling the story she had kept inside for so many years. With each word, it became harder. She recounted how she had met Nicholas Carlisle, how she had fallen in love with him when she was young and naive, and how their brief romance led to her pregnancy. She told him how Nicholas had rejected her, fired her, offered money to keep her quiet, and how she had been forced to start a new life, hiding his name from everyone to protect herself and her future child. As she spoke, she watched Marcus's expression change, from surprise to confusion and, finally, to understanding. After the story, Letitia felt both relief and guilt. She knew the truth could hurt him, and feared that he might want to meet the man who had once rejected them both. But despite this, she realized that Marcus had a right to know his past. Her heart was torn with contradictions. On one hand, she feared that knowledge of Nicholas would cause bitterness and resentment in her son, and on the other, she understood that he deserved to know who his father was, no matter how difficult that knowledge might be. Marcus was silent for a long time, absorbed in his thoughts. It seemed as though he was piecing together every detail he had just heard, reconstructing his life through a new lens, reevaluating moments that had once seemed unclear. In this young man, there was already a maturity and a drive for truth, no matter how bitter that truth might be. In the days that followed this candid conversation with his mother, Marcus often returned to thoughts about his father. He began researching Carlisle Holdings, the company owned by Nicholas. The more he learned, the stronger his desire grew to meet the man who had given him life, but who, perhaps, had never wanted him. Marcus understood that he was part of this story, and despite his mother's efforts to shield him from pain, he could no longer ignore his past. For Letitia, this was a challenging period. She saw her son delving deeper into his search, gradually revealing his inner struggles. She didn't know if he would ever be able to forgive Nicholas, but she was certain that Marcus needed to follow this path himself to find peace within. 20 years had passed since Letitia Brown, a young black woman, learned she was expecting a child with Nicholas Carlisle. Throughout this time, she had raised Marcus alone, facing hardships and concealing the truth about his father from him. But when Marcus grew up and accidentally discovered his past, he felt an overwhelming urge to find Nicholas and confront him face to face, seeking answers his mother had always avoided. For several months, Marcus gathered information, studying everything about Carlyle Holdings and the man who was his biological father. He learned about Nicholas's business, his successes, his esteemed reputation, and finally found his office in the city's business center. He realized that this meeting was his chance to understand his past and to find answers that would haunt him for the rest of his life if he didn't seize the opportunity to talk. One evening, 20 years after Nicholas had abandoned Letitia and their unborn child, Marcus approached the office building of Carlyle Holdings. He waited at the entrance, watching as employees gradually left their workspaces until he finally spotted a figure that immediately seemed familiar. From the tall glass doors, surrounded by assistants and aides, Nicholas Carlyle emerged. He had changed over the years, but his posture, confident stride, and cold gaze remained the same. The silver strands in his hair only emphasized his dignified age, but he still looked like a man accustomed to power and respect. Marcus felt his heart pounding. He had waited for this moment too long, and now he was finally face to face with the man who, for his entire life, had been only a shadow from the past. Summoning all his courage, Marcus called out to Nicholas. Carlyle stopped, turning his head toward the stranger. His expression showed puzzlement and irritation. Clearly, he wasn't used to being stopped at his office by strangers. Marcus introduced himself and, without breaking eye contact with Nicholas, told him who he was. When he spoke his mother's name, Letitia Brown, Nicholas froze for a moment. His expression changed. His eyes widened with a flicker of surprise, and then he tensed. It was clear that he remembered Letitia's name, though he tried not to show it. He examined Marcus carefully, as if trying to detect familiar features, and it seemed he began to understand that the young man before him was his son. Nicholas gestured for his assistants to leave them alone. They stepped back a little, exchanging glances of interest and surprise, while Nicholas motioned for Marcus to sit on a nearby bench. Inside, he seemed to be wrestling with conflicting emotions, but he strove to maintain an appearance of calm and composure, the manner with which he was used to handling all matters. As they sat, a tense silence settled between them. Marcus felt as though he were in a foreign world, sitting next to the man who, essentially, had always been just a ghost from the past. Finally, Nicholas spoke, his voice cold and restrained. He asked why Marcus had decided to meet him after so many years and how he had learned of his origins. His questions were more formal, as if Nicholas wanted to emphasize that he owed nothing to this young man. Keeping his composure, Marcus recounted how his mother had long concealed the truth about his father, but how, upon learning it one day, he decided to uncover the full story himself. Nicholas listened with an indifferent expression, showing no warmth or remorse. Instead, his eyes held a slight irritation, as if Marcus's appearance had disrupted the orderly life he had long since moved on from. When Marcus finished, Nicholas couldn't hold back and began to speak coldly, justifying himself by saying that his relationship with Letitia had been a youthful mistake, something she should have understood was never serious. He began explaining that he had offered her money to avoid this situation and that she had chosen to leave. In his words, he felt no sense of responsibility and even claimed that Letitia was to blame for her own difficult fate. With every word from Nicholas, Marcus clenched his fists tighter, feeling his anger build. He had come for the truth, but instead he was met with cruel indifference and disdain. Nicholas Carlyle proved to be not only distant and aloof, but also heartless, seeing Marcus not as a son, but as a mere inconvenience. Nicholas continued speaking, belittling Letitia and her efforts, which only infuriated Marcus further. Unable to hold back, Marcus interrupted him, stating that he hadn't come for excuses, and certainly not to hear his mother spoken of in such a tone. He said he had come for the truth, and now he finally knew it. His father had never wanted him, had never felt any responsibility or emotions toward him. These words sounded like a final verdict, and Nicholas's face reflected cold incomprehension. as if he couldn't understand that Marcus truly did not need his blessing or support. After another prolonged silence, Nicholas looked at Marcus with disdain and dryly stated that there was no point in their meeting and that they had nothing more to discuss. He stood up without saying goodbye and walked toward his car, as if this were just a routine business meeting he wanted to forget as soon as possible. Marcus remained seated, stunned and heartbroken. He watched Nicholas walk away, his figure fading into the evening gloom, and felt all his hopes of reconciliation with his father dissolve like ashes. He had come for answers, but instead he received only confirmation that his father was not someone he could ever be proud of. With bitterness and a heavy heart, Marcus rose and headed home. His hope that he could understand his origins had turned into disappointment and pain. Yet, despite this, he realized that this meeting had given him something valuable, the understanding that he did not need this man to be whole. After the meeting with his father, which left only bitterness and resentment in Marcus's heart, he returned home utterly devastated. The journey home was long, but it barely gave him enough time to process the flood of emotions he felt. It seemed to him that everything he had been searching for, everything he had hoped to find, had turned to ashes. Nicholas not only failed to acknowledge him, but revealed himself as someone willing to shirk his responsibility if it threatened his reputation. When Marcus arrived home, Letitia immediately noticed that he was deeply troubled. She saw the pain in his eyes, a pain she herself had once felt, and instinctively knew that he had met with Nick after all. Letitia had anticipated this moment, but she hadn't prepared herself for how profoundly it would affect him. She knew that sooner or later the truth would catch up with her son, but seeing the anguish on his weary face, she felt the full weight of his disappointment. The days that followed were silent. Letitia tried to support Marcus, but he withdrew into himself, as if digesting everything that had happened. He felt as though his life had fundamentally changed, and he couldn't continue as before. His idealistic hope that he might have a father, even if belatedly, was shattered. Nicholas had made it clear that, to him, Marcus was nothing more than a mistake from the past. After some time sensing that Marcus was ready to talk, Letitia sat down beside him. He finally opened up, recounting the events of their encounter. At first he spoke calmly, but soon his voice grew louder, his emotions spilling over. He spoke of Nicholas's cold words, his disdain, and his attempts to justify himself. Letitia listened attentively, not interrupting, but her heart broke for her son. She realized that this meeting had crushed in him any remaining hope for justice. When Marcus finished, his eyes were filled with a determination that Letitia hadn't expected to see. He told her that he couldn't let things rest as they were. Now he knew the truth of how Nicholas had treated them, and he felt that this man had to be held accountable. Marcus no longer wanted to silently endure the indifference and contempt. He felt a strong urge to seek justice, not only for himself, but also for his mother, who had suffered for so many years because of Nicholas's actions. These words unsettled Letitia. She had always avoided scandal and conflict, preferring to keep her past hidden. She believed that true justice was found in moving forward and not looking back. But as she looked at Marcus, she realized that he wouldn't be able to live peacefully if he didn't try to make a change. She saw the fire in his eyes, and she knew he was determined to see this through. Marcus began to study the law and sought to understand how he could hold Nicholas accountable. He visited public organizations that offered legal advice, researched matters concerning paternity recognition rights and compensation for emotional distress. He knew it wouldn't be easy to gather evidence or win a case against such a powerful person, but that didn't deter him. The more he learned, the stronger his resolve became. Seeing his determination, Letitia couldn't stand back. She understood that Marcus needed her support to feel confident in this fight. Together, they began searching for a lawyer who could help them in this challenging case. They met with several attorneys, most of whom warned them that the case would be tough and lengthy. A powerful man like Nicholas Carlisle could easily sidestep the law and evade responsibility, especially with a team of seasoned lawyers at his disposal. Nevertheless, despite all the obstacles, they found a lawyer named Rachel Williams, who agreed to take on their case. Rachel was young, but resolute and driven. She believed in justice and wasn't afraid to confront powerful people. Her straightforwardness and confidence inspired trust in Letitia and Marcus, and they decided to entrust her with this important matter. Together with Rachel, they began to plan a strategy. They would need to gather all possible evidence and testimonies to prove that Nicholas knew about his son and had willfully shirked his responsibilities. Letitia brought old letters she had once written to Nicholas and a few photographs of them together. These pieces of evidence were weak, but they provided a starting point. Rachel warned them that the fight would be difficult. Nicholas would undoubtedly do everything he could to avoid a public scandal. But knowing that Letitia and Marcus were ready for this, she encouraged them, reminding them that the truth could always be defended if they were prepared for the hardships. The preparations for the lawsuit dragged on for several months, and during that time, Marcus and Letitia faced many trials. They realized that this process wasn't only about justice, but also about reclaiming their sense of dignity. With each passing day, Marcus felt himself growing stronger, no longer the young man who waited for recognition from his father. Now he knew he was worth more, and that he was capable of protecting his mother and his future from the man who had abandoned them. One evening, as they discussed the upcoming trial, Letitia looked at him with pride and admitted that she supported him in this fight, no matter how difficult it might be. This moment was special for them. They understood that, despite all the challenges, they would endure. Several months had passed since Marcus and Letitia decided to initiate legal proceedings against Nicholas Carlisle. Along with their attorney, Rachel Williams, they meticulously prepared for the upcoming trial. They were about to confront a system that seemed entirely on the side of the wealthy and powerful, but Rachel gave them confidence. Her professionalism and resilience were the anchor that kept them from despair. The first days of the trial were focused on presenting the case. Marcus and Letitia's side provided the court with evidence proving that Nicholas Carlisle knew about Letitia's pregnancy, but chose not to take responsibility for their child. Every piece of evidence was the result of months of preparation, painstaking work, and effort. The documents included letters that Letitia had once sent to Nicholas, as well as testimonies from former employees who remembered the relationship between them. These pieces of evidence were few, but they helped establish the foundation of the case. Nicholas hired the best legal team, known for its aggressive approach and success in defending wealthy clients. On the very first days of the trial, Nicholas's lawyers attempted to undermine the credibility of Letitia and Marcus. They asked questions intended to portray her in an unflattering light, suggesting that her actions might be financially motivated. They implied that the case was merely an attempt to obtain money and made no attempt to hide this insinuation from the court. Letitia knew that they would try to paint her negatively. She had prepared for this with Rachel, but when Nicholas's lawyers crossed the line, it was difficult for her to maintain composure. The questions touched on some of the most painful moments of her life, and each answer brought her back to the days when she was alone with her fears and struggles. Yet, despite it all, Letitia remained strong. She understood that for Marcus, for justice, and for her own dignity, she could not allow herself to break. Marcus also found himself in the spotlight. He was called to testify, forced to speak about his fatherless childhood and how he learned the truth about his origins. His father's cold, contemptuous gaze was fixed on him as he spoke, but Marcus tried to ignore it. He spoke of his mother's struggles to provide for them, of how their hardships were not mere accidents, but the result of Nicholas's irresponsibility and indifference. Each word Marcus spoke resonated with pain in his heart. He recalled moments when he envied other children who had fathers and how he had to explain to himself why his own father had never shown any interest in him. This had been his personal struggle, his desire for acknowledgement, but now he realized he no longer sought it from Nicholas. Now he was fighting not for approval, but for justice. The defense, in turn, attempted to paint Marcus as a naive young man manipulated by his mother for her own purposes. The lawyers asked questions hinting that Letitia might have instilled resentment toward his father in him, using his emotions for her own agenda. Marcus answered clearly and confidently, not allowing their accusations to affect his stance. He knew the defense would try to discredit his story, casting it as a mere attempt at financial gain, so he remained resolute. With each passing week of the trial, the pressure on Letitia and Marcus increased. They faced constant provocations and attempts to undermine them. The defense spared neither their feelings nor their story, and each time Letitia left the courtroom, she felt drained. Yet the support from Marcus and Rachel kept her spirits up. She knew that every answer she gave and every piece of evidence she provided was a step closer to finally achieving justice. Rachel, their attorney, was remarkable. She represented Letitia and Marcus with determination and firmness, each of her words carefully chosen to protect their interests. She countered every argument from the defense, found weaknesses in their position, and this bolstered Marcus and Letitia's belief that their chances weren't so slim. Rachel showed the court that Letitia was a woman who had endured much and had never sought profit, only justice. An essential part of the trial involved testimony from people who had once worked in Nicholas Carlisle's household. Many had long since lost contact with him, but some agreed to testify on Letitia's behalf, confirming that they knew of her relationship with Nicholas. They described how she had been suddenly dismissed without explanation after news of her pregnancy emerged. These testimonies were powerful, reinforcing Letitia's words and undermining the defense's version of events. However, the most challenging part of the trial was yet to come. They would now have to officially state in court that Nicholas Carlisle was Marcus's father. Rachel insisted on a DNA test as irrefutable evidence of paternity. This proposal provoked a storm of outrage from Nicholas and his lawyers, but the judge agreed with Rachel's reasoning. The court ordered the test, which would scientifically confirm Nicholas's paternity. When the test results were ready, they confirmed what Letitia and Marcus had known all along. Nicholas was indeed Marcus's father. This fact became a pivotal moment in the case, and Rachel made sure to emphasize it in court. Nicholas's defense was now seriously weakened, and his lawyers shifted to attempts at minimizing his responsibility. Yet it became increasingly clear that Nicholas would not be able to evade the consequences of his actions. In the courtroom, when the DNA results were announced, Letitia felt a mixture of relief and bitterness. These pieces of evidence, as essential as they were to the case, only confirmed her most painful truth, that Nicholas had known about her child and had consciously turned his back on them. She saw Marcus standing strong, though she knew it wasn't easy for him to relive this over and over. Now, as the judge reviewed the evidence and testimonies from both sides, the outcome of the case became increasingly apparent. Each day in court reminded them of how far they had come and how much they had already done to achieve justice. Now, with the DNA test confirming paternity and witness testimonies adding even more weight to their story, Marcus and Letitia felt that their struggle was approaching its decisive moment. These long days and weeks of grueling litigation had tested Marcus and Letitia's resilience and inner strength. They had endured countless humiliations and attempts to devalue their story, but now they saw that their efforts were not in vain. The final stage of the trial lay ahead, a concluding phase in which the judge would deliver the verdict. The days leading up to the final hearing were the most tense for Marcus and Letitia. Despite all the hardships they had endured, they felt they were close to reaching the goal they had pursued for nearly a year. Yet, the impending session, where the judge would issue a final decision, brought anxiety and nervousness. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every argument from both the defense and the prosecution would be weighed, and the fate of their case would rest in the hands of one person. On the day of the hearing, Marcus and Letitia arrived at the courthouse early. Rachel, their lawyer, met them at the entrance with a reserved yet confident smile. Her support and professionalism had been a true pillar for them. That day, the courtroom was filled not only with lawyers and witnesses, but also with journalists whose interest had been piqued by Nicholas Carlisle's name, a prominent and influential businessman caught in the center of a scandal. As the session began, the tension in the air was palpable. The judge entered and took her seat, then proceeded to invite both sides to present their closing arguments. Nicholas's lawyers spoke first. Once again, they attempted to cast the case in a negative light, arguing that Letitia and Marcus were simply pursuing financial gain. They insisted that for all these years, Letitia hadn't sought help, and now, after 20 years, her actions were nothing more than an attempt to exploit Nicholas's status. But Rachel was ready for these arguments. She confidently delivered her closing statement, outlining Letitia's story, a young, single black woman who had faced neglect and rejection at a difficult time in her life. She described the hardships Letitia and Marcus had endured, the long years when Letitia had raised her son alone without support, and the fact that she had hidden the truth to protect him. Rachel skillfully emphasized that this case was not about money, but about justice and the right to recognition. She presented Marcus as someone who, despite his father's indifference, had found the strength to face his past and demand accountability. She spoke of the importance of truth, of the right every person has to know their origins and live with integrity, regardless of circumstances. Rachel's closing words were powerful, filled with resolve and conviction, and each of her arguments seemed unbreakable. After the closing statements, the judge announced a recess to deliberate. In that moment, Marcus and Letitia remained in the courtroom, looking at each other with understanding. To them, this was more than just a legal battle. It was the final closure of the pain and suffering that had lingered since the moment Nicholas had abandoned them. They knew that regardless of the court's decision, they had done everything possible to protect their dignity and honor. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. She took her seat and, casting a brief glance at both sides, began reading her ruling. Her voice was clear and confident, and every word she spoke was weighted with meaning. The judge stated that the evidence presented was compelling, and that the testimonies left no room for doubt. She noted that this case touched on fundamental rights, the right to recognition and the support of a child, regardless of the parent's social status. The judge concluded that Nicholas Carlisle had been aware of Letitia's pregnancy and had willfully avoided his responsibilities, depriving Letitia and Marcus of the support they were entitled to. She then announced her decision. The court ruled that Nicholas must pay compensation for all the years during which Letitia had cared for their son alone. This compensation included not only financial support, but also damages for the emotional distress they had suffered. Additionally, Nicholas was ordered to make ongoing payments to support Marcus's education and health care needs. When the judge delivered the ruling, quiet applause rippled through the courtroom before quickly fading. Marcus and Letitia sat in silence, absorbing the significance of the moment. They knew they had gained more than just financial compensation. It was an acknowledgement that their struggle had not been in vain, and that the truth had been on their side. They had finally achieved what they had fought for: justice. Nicholas remained in his seat, his face expressionless, though Letitia noticed a hint of weariness in his eyes, perhaps even regret. Marcus looked at him one last time, feeling the weight that had burdened his heart since childhood finally lift. He realized that he no longer needed his father's recognition or approval. He was ready to leave it all behind. When the judge left the courtroom, Letitia and Marcus embraced, feeling an incredible sense of relief. Rachel approached them, her face glowing with pride and happiness for her clients. She congratulated them on their victory, knowing that their story had touched her as well. She had seen their struggle, their resilience, and understood that they had earned this success. As they exited the courtroom, journalists surrounded them, showering them with questions. Letitia held herself with dignity, answering briefly and clearly, while Marcus, despite his emotions, remained calm. He understood that now, They were not merely victims of a story, but symbols of resilience and justice. They left Nicholas and his world behind, ready to move forward and build their future without looking back. That evening, they returned home, knowing they had finally broken free from the chains that had bound them for so many years. This victory meant not only financial support, but a sense of closure. It was the final chapter in their long journey, filled with pain and hardship. A few weeks had passed since the conclusion of the trial, but for Marcus and Letitia, everything was just beginning. The court's decision not only lifted the heavy burden of the past, but also provided them with financial stability they had never known. Now new opportunities lay before them, and they finally felt they could live without looking back. After years of relentless struggle, Letitia could finally allow herself a moment of rest and start thinking about living her remaining years on her own terms. Gone were the constant worries about money that had plagued her every moment. A newfound confidence began to grow in her heart, something she had never before imagined. Marcus, too, was undergoing profound changes. He felt more self-assured, knowing that he had finally secured justice not only for himself, but for his mother. Now he could pursue goals and dreams that had once seemed unattainable. With the financial means they had received, Marcus could finally pursue his ambitions. He applied to one of the best universities, determined to get an education and build a career that would allow him to support those who needed protection. For Letitia, the victory in court was also a source of moral satisfaction. She felt that her long and difficult journey, from a youth filled with disappointments and betrayal to a woman who had raised her son alone, had not been in vain. She had proved to herself and to the world that her life had value and that no one had the right to diminish it. She decided to dedicate herself to community work to help other women in similar situations. Inspired by her own experiences, she wanted to share her story with those struggling to uphold their rights and dignity. One autumn evening, Letitia and Marcus gathered at a small cafe near their home to celebrate the changes in their lives. The crisp autumn air was cool, and yellow leaves rustled underfoot, as if carrying away all their old worries and resentments. They spoke about the future, about their plans and dreams, and it was one of those rare moments when they truly felt free. Marcus shared with a smile his desire to create a foundation that would help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. He wanted to give them the opportunities he himself had lacked as a child, to help them understand that their lives had value, regardless of their social status. Letitia listened to him with pride, seeing the person he had become. Her heart was full of warmth and joy for her son, and she felt that everything she had endured for him had been worth it. However, this new life, full of freedom and opportunity, brought unexpected surprises. One evening, Letitia received a letter from Nicholas Carlyle. She was surprised and even unsettled to see his name on the envelope. Opening it, she read it slowly, reflecting on each word. In the letter, Nicholas apologized for his behavior and expressed regret for the years he had spent in coldness and indifference. He acknowledged that his fear of scandal and prejudice toward Letitia had led him to make mistakes that he could not forgive himself for. Nicholas wrote that he had followed the trial, and though he would never publicly admit it, he had come to realize his guilt internally. He felt he had acted shamefully and tried to convey his regret for the unfairness he had shown to Letitia and Marcus. In the letter, he even offered to meet in person to apologize, but Letitia wasn't sure if she wanted that. Reading the letter, she felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, the wound from the past was still painful, and she wasn't sure she could forgive someone who had kept her in the shadows for so long. On the other hand, this letter felt like a symbol of victory, not only in court, but over her own fears and pain. She realized that she no longer felt the anger toward Nicholas that had once tormented her. Now, he was simply a figure from the past, whose power over her had dissolved with the court's ruling. Letitia decided to leave the letter unanswered. She understood that forgiveness for her was not something she needed to express in words to someone else, but an internal liberation she had already experienced. She did not need this meeting and felt that the strength and support she found in Marcus provided her with everything she needed for the future. That evening, Letitia shared the contents of the letter with Marcus. He listened attentively, and though there was a hint of frustration on his face, he also understood that this chapter of their lives was now closed forever. Marcus embraced his mother, knowing they had endured so much and left it all behind. Now, their lives no longer depended on the past, and they could move forward without looking back. With each passing day, Marcus and Letitia grew closer, their relationship deepening, and they were now not just mother and son, but true allies, supporting each other in all their endeavors. Inspired by Marcus's example, Letitia became actively involved in community work, helping women in difficult life situations. She organized workshops, helped women access legal support, and instilled confidence in them. Marcus started his university studies, and his new friends and colleagues saw him as someone who was ready to stand up for justice and fight for the rights of others. His life experiences had given him strength and resilience, and now he knew he could face any challenges that lay ahead. That year, as their new life began, Marcus and Letitia felt they had finally found their place in the world. It was a time for new goals, for caring for others, and for achieving heights they had once only dreamed of. They had left their past behind, becoming stronger, wiser, and closer to each other. The story of Letitia and Marcus is one of resilience, overcoming adversity, and finding strength in the deepest wounds. They had proven to themselves and the world that justice is possible if one fights for it. And despite the long years of pain, they now faced a future filled with light, hope, and boundless possibilities.